This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and I'm on the line with Darrell Whitman. He was a former OSHA federal investigator here at the Whistleblower Protection Program in San Francisco, and he was investigating the cases of workers who had been retaliated against, fired for complaining about health and safety issues, and he made merit determinations, which he did in the case of Michael Madry, who was with Test America, and the tests were being falsified at Hunters Point and Treasure Island, and other cases as well, Lockheed Martin, PG&E, FedEx. And when he made these determinations, he then was bullied and fired from OSHA, and he tried to do an investigation, call for an investigation by Tom Perez, who at that time was Secretary of Labor and in charge of the agency, and is now, of course, chair of the Democratic Party. But in the case of his effort to get justice and also defend himself and the other whistleblowers, he discovered that the inspector generals, not only at the Department of Labor, but other agencies themselves were in collusion together to prevent whistleblowers and others from having their cases taken seriously. Welcome to WorkWeek, Darrell.
Happy to be here, Steve. Always good to talk to you.
So why don't you talk about what you learned, what you have learned, and it's been years in this fight for justice, a fight for a fight for accountability, fight for accountability in the federal government with agencies and officials whose job it is to protect the integrity of the federal government.
Well, just this month, in January, I celebrated my 5th anniversary of fighting the corrupt government, as it were. So it's been a long, much longer, of course, than anyone ever expects. And I think, sadly, for most whistleblowers, their experience is that they react to something that they see. Some misbehavior, a threat to health, safety, or financial security. And it's kind of most whistleblowers are just doing the right thing in their own mind. And oftentimes they're doing it instinctively. It's not like they sit around planning to be a whistleblower. And most of them will tell you, if they had a chance to think about it, then they might reconsider having blown the whistle in the first place. Because there has been a war on whistleblowers that goes back, as far as I can determine, it goes back at least 20 years. So what you're seeing today has a long history to it. It didn't start with Edward Snowden. It had a predicate to that, and it developed since 1995, as far as we can figure. And when I say we, I have to acknowledge the other whistleblowers I'm working with now. There's really quite a large group. Whistleblowers United has a loose membership of about 25 private sector whistleblowers. And then on top of that, a group of federal whistleblowers has come together. And there's probably a dozen or so federal whistleblowers. And it's a testament to the importance of working with other people. Because without working with the private sector whistleblowers and them working with each other, we would not have learned what we've learned. We would not have the power that we now have, which is to change the system. So that idea of solidarity, I know it's a popular word, but sometimes we forget solidarity actually means working with other people. And sometimes working with people who are very different than you. Whistleblowers come in all different sizes, shapes, personalities, interests. Some of them are very socially conservative. Some of them are very radical. Some of them are union members. Some of them are kind of anti-union. But what they share is they share this kind of impulse to respecting the law and the rules. And not surprisingly, as you move from the common people out here, most everybody, has this underlying deference to the law. We stop at the red lights. Most of us stop at the red lights most of the time. We expect other people to stop at the red lights. If we didn't have that level of cooperation that comes with a shared system of law, we wouldn't have a society. So in the end, what whistleblowers are doing, they're reaffirming the importance of respecting the rights of other people as they appear in the law. And what we have all learned now, after many years, and with some of the people you've talked to, like Mike Madry, and you'll be talking to Aaron Stuckey, they have been fighting this battle for 10 years. 10 years, and at great personal cost to themselves. So to me, whistleblowers most of them are heroes. And they're not heroes because they set out to be, they're heroes because they were confronted with situations that they had to respond to, and they made the right choice. I think it's the right choice. I think we're going to prove it's the right choice.
And of course, the public has been very concerned about Boeing. The fact that there's no regulation by the FAA, basically Boeing runs their own situation, and it's led to serious health and safety concerns, and even the viability of American industry, American products. Is this a direct result of deregulation, privatization, and the capture of these agencies?
Well, yes, but you can even make a finer point out of it. It's a direct result of a design within the federal government that, we call it, I think a lot of people like to refer to it as neoliberalism. And it really came into force back in the 1970s. And during the 1970s, we had a reform of the civil service called the Civil Service Reform Act. And it consciously created a system in the federal government that opened the doors to corporate interests coming in and influencing the government, taking over agencies very directly. This is not an accident. It's by design. And you can ask the people who drafted the law why they did it that way, and I would be interested in what they said. But the reality is, it created these pathways. One of the pathways is something called the Senior Executive Service, which is actually an open door to corporate interest, because it is a system that allows for the appointment of people from corporate backgrounds and sometimes corporate officers to come into the government for a period of time and make policy decisions. It's written right into the law that the SES people are there for the purposes of managing policy. Well, wait a minute. I thought we elected people to office for that. Isn't Congress the place where we get policy? Isn't the executive branch where we get policy? What are these bureaucrats doing to make policy? And it's very insidious. SES people are super empowered because they're neither strictly political appointees nor are they strictly civil service employees. They are the managers of the government. And this group, Senior Executive Service, increasingly has taken power for itself. And that's not surprising. I think anyone who thought about it for very long would realize when you have a system where some people are protected from accountability, that's going to encourage corruption. What we've learned in going back through how this all started is that there's a very specific point in time where this group of SES people became the inspectors general. And we're hearing a lot about inspectors general these days. But the media doesn't really tell you what an inspector general is, what their authority is, what their purpose is. And that's a failure of the mainstream media to serve as the fourth estate. The mainstream media is more and more been a corporate media and less being a partner with the public to give us important information. The inspectors general were created as part of the Civil Service Reform Act. And at first it was just, a very small group of people, and they were appointed to just a few agencies. Well, now, 40 years later, there are 75 of them, and they cover almost the entire government. They are the policemen within the government that's supposed to provide accountability. It's supposed to be there to protect the public interest and ensure that corruption doesn't grow in the federal government. Well, starting in 1995, they began to see themselves as an elite of the elite. And they began to plan, and this is a conscious plan, to create a government inside the government, built around the inspectors general, who would have the authority and the power to initiate investigations on their own of anybody. And if you think about that, and to do it without any accountability. So if somebody was to bring a charge against an inspector general for wrongdoing, it would be investigated and heard by other inspectors general, not by a court, not by an outside agency, but strictly within this group of 75 inspectors general. Well, we can't have that. That is not equal justice under the law. That's not, protecting due process. That is a protection racket. Because as these inspectors general became increasingly, connected to the corporate interests that have invaded the government, they saw their purpose as to protect the corporate interests within the government by protecting the political appointees of the corrupt political employees like Tom Perez, and the senior bureaucrats who were serving the interests of the corporations. So as a consequence, we found that they did an audit. The Government Accountability Office did an audit that just came out in 2018 of the Inspectors General and of the Office of Special Counsel. And what the two represent are the internal and the external quality control systems for the government. Because the Inspectors General have the authority to, they're embedded with every agency. They have the authority to investigate, they're actually sworn police agents. They're authorized to carry weapons. They're authorized to arrest people. They're authorized to arrest people without warrants. This is a very powerful organization. And I, with all the talk about inspectors general, you never really get a conversation about who they are and what they're doing and what kinds of powers do they have. Well, one of the groups that they sought control over and gained control over was the Office of Special Counsel. And that agency is exclusively devoted to protecting whistleblowers, federal whistleblowers, who might step forward and say, I saw wrongdoing of some sort and I want to report it. So that's the external quality control system. And they have now captured that. So there's no one to oppose them, no one to restrain them, no one to hold them accountable for being incredibly corrupt. And it is an incredibly corrupt system. You could trace back, for instance, you talked a little bit about Boeing and the fact that we know, it came out publicly, it was reported publicly, that the FAA basically said to Boeing, you can just regulate yourself. We're not going to act as a regulating agency, which is what their mandate is, to ensure safety in among air carriers. We're going to let you take all those decisions and make all those choices and supervise yourself. Well, that's crazy. And we see the results of that. With a 737 MAX, we had 2 major accidents. And reported, over 400 people died and Boeing was out there doing its thing, deciding what it was and wasn't going to do for safety. And as a consequence, all these people died.
And Boeing's financial crisis now, the fact that no one wants to buy these planes, they can't get these planes in the air, may threaten the airline itself. So we're talking about deregulation, privatization, self-regulation by these corporations has led to what could be a big financial crisis for not just Boeing, but millions of people in the United States and around the world.
Absolutely. I'm not sure. I fly, or I used to fly a lot. I think, on a lot of airlines, you can look up the plane. What kind of equipment are they using? Is this an Airbus? Is this a Boeing? What kind of an airplane are they flying? You can find that out for every flight if you want to look for it. Well, I'm not going to fly a Boeing plane, am I? I would be crazy to fly a Boeing plane if Boeing is not being having their feet held to the fire for air safety.
And you had a case of FedEx, where actually FedEx was involved in colluding with the government to prevent their accountability for terminating workers who were reporting serious health and safety concerns.
Yeah. In fact, taking it just a step further, the evidence in a court case came out that the FAA was collaborating with FedEx to retaliate against whistleblowers. That seems, as incredible as that seems, that in fact is the case. And the FAA has not been held accountable for that collaboration either. So no one, you look out there and a lot of people fly. We're becoming a nation of people who rely on air transport. If you have a Federal Aviation Administration whose only job they think is to collaborate and support the airlines and to not provide the regulatory oversight, why would you want to fly an American plane out of an American airport? And then, of course,
the drug crisis too, opioids. The fact that there was no real regulation of these drug companies selling these opioids that were killing literally thousands, tens of thousands of people, and they were aware of it.
And again, the problem is you've got this system of inspectors general who are supposed to be the people who look at Boeing, because there is an FAA inspector general. Why isn't that inspector general conducting an investigation, reporting, holding the people inside the FAA to account for their violations of law? Because they are mandated to provide oversight, but they're not doing it.
So what you're saying, you're saying these inspector generals are actually themselves obstructing justice by refusing to enforce the regulations, which is their job at the agencies that they are doing oversight on. Is that what you're saying?
In fact, it's not just a matter of not doing it. That they see as their purpose is to protect the wrongdoing, the violations of law, the waste and fraud, and the rest of it. They're actually protecting the people inside the government that are doing that. It's a protection racket. What did they get out of it? Well, the SES work with corporate interests. So what you see is, if you notice, if you look closely, you'll see people are going in and out of government, into these positions and out of these positions. They go from being an SES that makes, easily, if they have, say, 10 years service in the federal government, an SES is making more than your congressperson or your senator. They have this amazing package of compensation and privileges that no one else in the federal government has, including your elected representatives, except for the president. And that might encourage them to delusions of grandeur.
So these whistleblowers at these many agencies that we're talking about, Department of Defense, many agencies, you've come together and you've sent a letter to Senator Feinstein. What is that letter all about, and what are you trying to do in that letter to Feinstein and also other senators and government officials?
Well, the reason I'm sending it to Senator Feinstein is way back 5 years ago when I first began to contest with the Inspector General in the Department of Labor. I had sent letters to people in Congress, including Senator Feinstein, about the corruption in OSHA, the corruption in the whistleblower program. And she was the only one of all the people I sent letters to. For some reason, in September of 2014, she sent me a letter and said, "Can I help you with your situation with the Department of Labor?" I was shocked. First of all, you usually only get a response from Congress people because they're the ones who do constituent services. But for her to take that initiative when nobody else did, there's obviously a reason she did that. But I began to give her information, her office, Carson Niello, who's her constituent service person there in San Francisco. I began to give them documents and keep them informed about what was going on. And then when when the Inspector General refused to do an investigation, and I went to the Office of Special Counsel, they kind of dropped the case. And that's kind of understandable because most of your Congress people and senators, if there's an agency involved, they just simply assume that everything's fine and that you'll be taken care of by the agency, so they don't need to be involved. And that happens over and over again. I think anyone who's tried to go and appeal to their congressperson or their senator, that's a common experience. They'll just go so far, and then they kind of drop the ball. So that's what happened with Senator Feinstein. But obviously, the cases I was talking about, one of them was Mike Madry's case. And what Mike had found was the falsification of industrial environmental testing by Test America, the largest testing company in the United States. And among other clients, they served the Navy there at Hunters Point and Treasure Island. They were the ones who were actually doing the analysis of the samples that were being produced by the Navy and other agencies that they had contracted for. And what Mike reported was their process is corrupt. And again, it's one of those situations where the invasion from the outside, the corporate interests, trumped the interests of the American public. And when I was writing to Senator Feinstein in 2014, that was becoming known. That's when Mr. Madry and I kind of worked together a little bit to begin to uncover what was happening with the testing there at Hunters Point. And he realized that Test America was doing those tests and that they needed to be held to account because their testing process they'd sacrificed the integrity of the testing for profit.
They changed the Test America was bought by HIG Capital, right, which was a funder of President Obama and Hillary Clinton, but they changed the testing procedures to save money with the game pad.
It was actually more like ordinarily, as I understood from talking to experts in the field, the asbestos tests ordinarily take a minimum of 6 minutes. And most of the credible tests take about 8 to 10 minutes. And Test America was actually reporting that they were conducting these tests in less than 20 seconds.
This is for asbestos. Well, that obviously wasn't credible. It was they were getting returns of 100% negative on tests for asbestos at Hunters Point, which is filled with asbestos.
What they were doing, they were auto-populating from one field to another, from one sample to another. They get a sample up and it's all negative. So in their computers, they just populate for the next sample the same results. because they're getting paid by the number of tests that they do. And the more tests that they can cram into, the 8-hour days that they have, the more money they're going to make. And that was the idea. That's why they introduced this system. And they were actually paying employees bonuses based on the number of tests that they would complete in a day. And in an 8-hour day, thinking you have, bathroom breaks, you have lunch and everything else. Some of these people were producing 200 tests a day. Well, it's just not credible. It's not credible.
And it turns out that Senator Feinstein, her husband, Richard Blum, Nancy Pelosi, her cousin, Lawrence Pelosi, worked for Lennar, who's a developer at Hunters Point and Treasure Island. It turns out that they are building condos on a radioactive nuclear dump site at Hunters Point and Treasure Island, and somehow Treasure Island was removed from the Superfund site, even though it's a contaminated nuclear weapons training facility. For decades, for 30 years, they've been pumping nuclear radioactive material on that island, Treasure Island in San Francisco, and yet it's not on the Superfund site. I wonder why it's not on the Superfund site.
Well, who designates Superfund sites? The EPA, right? That's the agency responsible. Who's the agency responsible for oversight of the environmental testing industry? The EPA. So what does that tell you? They knew, the EPA had reports because that's what Mr. Madrid's job was to report these things and maintain quality assurance in the testing. They had the results as far back as 2009 that they knew that this company was producing, at least let me be polite and say questionable results. But what did they do? They didn't decertify them. They didn't investigate. They didn't even, the irony is we found out they are supposed to produce audits every 2 years of these laboratories to see what they're doing. Well, one thing we found out, I was shocked, that the auditors, when the auditor goes in, say, 2009 and finds out about the problem, writes it up, all this stuff, this paperwork goes into what was then the NVLAP, the National Volunteer Laboratory Accreditation Program, which is part of the EPA. They report it to NVLAP, and then 2 years later, there's a new audit. And guess what? NVLAP does not give the new auditor the information from the previous audit as a matter of practice. So they're in there blind, completely blind. They have no idea what's going on in the lab. And if they report it again, the same thing happens every 2 years.
And of course, $1 billion of our tax dollars was spent on the supposed cleanup, remediation, and testing at Treasure Island and Hunters Point. And now the Navy has been forced to admit that the tests were falsified. 2 executives of Tetra Tech were convicted and put in federal prison. Yet Tetra Tech is still getting federal contracts around the country. And in fact, Governor Newsom, who was mayor of San Francisco, just awarded them a $200 million contract, or it was awarded by Brown, but approved by Newsom, a $200 million contract to clean up the campfire in Northern California. So it seems like violating the law and covering up and corruption is quite unimportant as far as continuing to get more contracts from the federal government and state government.
It's systemic, and it extends across the government. That's what is very scary here. We're not talking about individual incidents, whether it's with the FAA or the EPA or the NRC or the Department of Defense. We're not talking about individual incidents, where somebody just overlooked or they failed to see it or there's one person that was corrupt. We're talking about a corrupt system within the federal government that protects and makes sure that these people never are held to account. So what does that mean? That means the public is at huge risk all the time from every part of the federal government.
And
the inspector general are going to protect them.
And this letter that you put together, which is a very important document, accounting or educating people about the letters and the people that were informed about it. It seems like you've done your homework as far as informing all these government officials about the systemic corruption and locking them in so they know about it. They can't say that they don't know about it. Senator Feinstein knows about it, and she sent you a letter, in fact. So what is their response going to be to this letter outlining the systemic corruption?
This is interesting because this letter is going to go to Senator Sinema in Arizona as well. And that's because Senator Sinema was approached by one of the whistleblowers in Arizona about the problem with the inspectors general. And he reported it. There were three of them that reported it to Senator Sinema, to Senator McSally, the other senator in Arizona, to their individual Congress people. And the only one who responded to their a very, very well documented case saying, hey, we've got an inspector general in the Department of Labor, Scott Dahl, who's a crook. And he's refusing to conduct investigations to hold senior people accountable for the crimes that they're committing. And so Senator Sinema, to her credit, was the only one of them who actually responded and said, oh, well, how can I help you? So what she did, which is what Congress people do, what senators do, they sent a letter. She sent a letter to Scott Dahl saying, well, what are you doing? Right? It was a very polite, just a request for a status of what's going on with this case. And so Scott Dahl sends her a letter back, and he admits he's not conducting an investigation. But the senators and the Congress people don't know how this system works. And that's the great tragedy. This system of protection was created behind the curtains, very secretively. It was done with the cooperation and the support of people, not the senators and congressmen themselves, but from their staff. And people don't recognize that the staff of a senator or congressman are very powerful people. They're the gatekeepers. They're the ones who do or don't share information with the people that they're working for. And these people are appointed by whom? They're appointed by the parties. Their loyalty is to the party. So if you're a Democrat senator, your staff, particularly for new ones like Senator Sinema, her staff is recommended to her by the party. And of course, she's expected to hire them because they're party loyalists. But who are they working for? Are they working for Senator Sinema, Senator Feinstein, Senator Harris? They're working for the party. And if the party, as the Democrat Party is, it's up to its eyeballs in corruption, they're part of the system that has corrupted the federal government since 1995. And a lot of the people like Thomas Perez, he's a chair of the Democratic Party, thoroughly corrupt. And their first instinct is, we're going to protect our party people.
By Morgan Stanley and Jackie Spear. What happened with that? Because it was reported she's known as the whistleblower protector in Congress. What happened with that case and the effort of Johnny Burris to go to her office and explain what was going on with Morgan Stanley?
She did nothing to help him or to report the program or investigate it. People join these groups because it's good PR. Jackie Spear is one of those people. They're going to join whatever group, a good government group, or we love the trees group, or whatever. It has nothing to do with her convictions, with her values. It has everything to do with her ambitions. And unfortunately, there are people on these committees, like the whistleblower group, who join things like that basically just to sit there and occupy space so they can list it on their website, so they can put it on their campaign literature, but they don't actually do anything. They even can be counterproductive because people go to them expecting, well, you're a whistleblower, you're part of this whistleblower group, they must be working to help whistleblowers. Wrong. They're not.
And you also went to Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, about your...
She was my congressperson at the time.
And what was your experience there?
Well, I mean, it was very strange because at the time I was a union steward working in the Department of Labor.
With the American Federation of Government Employees, yes.
Yeah, I became very aware that there was a widespread disregard for worker employee rights, EEO rights, equal employment opportunity rights. It became obvious that there's a certain amount of racism in the department. That there's overt discrimination against women. There's overt discrimination against people with disabilities. And as I saw that more and more, and I had my own case with the Department of Labor, I wrote to to Congresswoman Lee's office, and started giving them information. Well, one of her aides called me, and I have her name somewhere, and we started about a year and a half's conversation about the problems of the Department of Labor in San Francisco, and what I learned was the Congresswoman Lee's office was under surveillance because they were two activists. Some people in it were two activists on some of these issues, and somebody, they didn't know who. I mean, this woman was telling me she was a senior aide. That their telephones were being tapped. We had to go out in the hall, down the end of the corner of the hall, and hide. This
wasn't Russia or China tapping their phones. So
no.
This was somebody else.
This was in Oakland, the federal building.
It wasn't Russia going into her phones.
No. Well, the last meeting I had with her, and she's very nice, and she's really trying to help. She told me about how many cases they had people contact them about this widespread discrimination in the Department of Labor, of all places, and the fact that nothing was being done about it. Nothing.
And AFGE, American Federation of Government Employees of President Cox, you tried to alert him and contact him about the workplace bullying, the retaliation, the corruption in the agency. What was your experience with President Cox of AFGE?
Well, again, I'm a union guy. I've been a union guy all my life, and I was proud to be a union steward. Eventually, became representative on the San Francisco Labor Council for AFGE. But the reality is, there are unions and there are unions, and there's the problem with AFGE is AFGE leadership is actually controlled by the federal government, by the government, not by the employees. They're paid by the government. What happens, Brother Cox is a federal employee that doesn't have to go to work. Instead, he just goes over to his office at AFGE and he gets paid, gets all these benefits. Oh, he gets awards too. They get to go to lunch and have all of these, interesting conversations with powerful people in Washington. And what happens to their membership? And they haven't represented their membership in years.
And you went to a conference in Europe about whistleblowing. Apparently, President Cox was there.
Yes, he was, but he didn't come to my program, which was about corruption. He avoided that little group.
And you have a situation where government employees such as yourself, but thousands are being threatened at EPA and other agencies for opening their mouths. Yes. In fact, they say that you can't even talk about impeachment if you are a federal employee. What is going on?
Well, obviously, the federal employee, it's as one of my fellow employees said, one of the fellow attorneys I worked with in the Whistleblower Protection Program said one day, she says, working here is like working at a concentration camp.
Well, I think you had that experience when you came up with a report about Michael Madry, his retaliation, discrimination, and
Right.
a merit report. And then you went to your boss, Joshua Paul. What happened when you made this report to your boss, who is also a lawyer at OSHA, the Whistleblower Protection Program?
He tried to bury, not only the case, he tried to bury Mr. Madry. Because Mr. Madry was very persistent, and he knew what he was talking about. He's an expert, in the process. He's a quality control person. And not only that, but his boss, the national director of quality assurance, was also fired by the company for reporting, the corruption of the testing. So, and Mr. Madry just kept pressing Mr. Paul to produce a result, to do his job. I mean, real simple request, please do your job. And you're supposed to do this in 90 days, and it's now been a year and a half. And what are you doing? So when he complained, Mr. Paul closed his case.
Was that legal?
No, of course not. Of course not. He'd had just a couple of weeks earlier assured Mr. Madry that that he agreed with the merits of his case, but he wasn't going to allow Mr. Madry to criticize him for his being incompetent. Well, it was more than incompetence. He was keeping the case in his office without reviewing it, because that's a strategy. If you're going to conduct an investigation, a true investigation, you're investigating people. You're investigating documents and witness statements. And the longer you put off doing a real investigation, the more you muck up the investigation, the less chance there is of anybody who's actually guilty of something being held to account. And that's the strategy: delay, isolate, control, and destroy.
And isn't that obstruction of justice?
Oh, yeah, that's a federal crime.
Joshua Paul, who was the lawyer who was in charge of you,
Yes.
Obstructed justice, cancel this case or shut down this case, and then he gets promoted by who's running OSHA at that time in the Department of Labor?
David Michaels.
So David Michaels, who was the head of OSHA, allowed the promotion of your boss, Joshua Paul, who was also a lawyer who had obstructed justice. Is that what you're saying?
Well, David, these political appointees do not get their hands dirty actually managing a program. What they do is they have SES people who actually run the programs and make the policy and make these choices.
And so he was promoted, and apparently he's carrying on business as usual.
Well, as far as I know, he is now doing his dirt with the Department of Defense.
Another agency where there's no corruption.
Well, the story was, earlier this year, somebody did some investigative reporting and found out that I think the year before, 2017 or 2018, there were 100,000 complaints inside this one agency, the Department of Defense, about corruption, waste of funds, etc., and none of them got investigated.
And one of the things that you've also run into is the media coverage of this. In California, you would think that $1 billion eco-fraud by the federal government would be a national story, especially since it's happening in the district of Senator Feinstein, the district of Congresswoman Pelosi, who was head of the Democratic Party. Yet there's been no national coverage. And NBC Investigates has done many, many stories on the corruption at Hunters Point, the firing of whistleblowers of Tetra Tech. And yet none of these national news services, NBC, CBS, Fox, none of them, NPR, have actually covered this as a national story. Do you find that rather strange?
Well, not anymore. I mean, this is pretty obvious I've had a lot of dealings with the media over the last 5-6 years, and there's a consistent pattern here. And it began actually when I wrote my letter to Secretary Perez, because I did it after working with Justin Pritchard, Associated Press reporter, investigative reporter, who was looking at the situation with FedEx. And he had called me, and we had a number of long conversations about the situation. He encouraged me, and I took the initiative to actually start to investigate myself and discover that there was systemic corruption preventing investigations of big corporate entities like FedEx. And he wanted to write about it. I mean, he's a good reporter. He's a classic reporter, but he has to work with editors. And people should understand, whether it's it's television news or magazines or newspapers, the New York Times, the story you read is not the story the reporter writes. It is the story that the reporter is asked to write by editors, an editorial group, who control what they look at, what they say, and what is actually published. So when you read, the next time you read the New York Times or the Washington Post or listen to NBC or CBS or certainly CNN, they're actually pretty transparent about it. What you're getting is you're getting propaganda.
It's sanitized information.
It's not even sanitized. Sometimes it's pretty stinky, but it is what the editorial control of that particular media outlet wants you to hear.
And is that why this story of the systemic corruption in the Inspector General's offices in the United States government has not been covered? Because you've been really going to the national media for a long, long time to say that there's a serious 5 years that there's a serious problem of accountability and lack of protection and enforcement of federal protection laws.
I think when I said that, if I had said that, and I did say it 4 or 5 years ago, people would have been very skeptical. I think today people have become much more sophisticated and understand that what they get from the mainstream media is propaganda. It's not news. And the people who are actually reporting, if you look at them, if you do any background on them, what you find is that they're not really genuine reporters. They're news readers or news writers. And the New York Times, of all publications, no longer does serious fact checking for their stories. And so there's very little credibility there.
And it's interesting because there's a escalating corruption scandal in the city and county of San Francisco with Mohammed Nuru, who was the director of public works that was on the take. He was involved in ordering nonprofit workers contracted by the city and county of San Francisco, African American, to campaign for Gavin Newsom when he was running for mayor. Yeah. And that was never held accountable. He's been involved in numerous cases of corruption, systemic corruption under Gavin Newsom, under Kamala Harris, who was district attorney. She never investigated the firing of whistleblowers and the corruption at the DPW. It seems like that enveloping corruption scandal may ensnare the leadership of the Democratic Party in San Francisco and California.
Yes, it will, and nationally.
Yeah,
the time is coming. The accountability is coming. You're going to start seeing it more and more. I mean, our group, to their credit, and again, this is a very diverse group of people. I don't know what their political affiliations are. I'm sure that there are, Republicans, there are Democrats. I'm a union guy. I'm to the left of most people in the Democratic Party, I would think. But the reality is what we all Americans should have in common is a respect for the law. We should be given, restore the law to the people, restore the government to the people. And that goes from both sides, from people who are, quote, progressives to people who are conservative. one of the things that has developed is a very odd kind of coalition of interests that extend, left to right. And what they share in common is that sense that we're being robbed of the essential integrity of our Constitution and our government. And they're right.
Well, both parties, Democrat and Republican, have been involved in this corruption. How do you see a change taking place? Because whether or not there's a Democratic president or a Republican president, It seems the corruption continues. These people are still being unaccountable. They're not held accountable for the crimes that they're committing.
I think that the biggest challenge we've had as a group and why we have done what we have done over the last couple of years is we have done the investigation that should have been done by the Department of Justice into the SIGI, the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, which is the IG cabal that's basically seized control of the government. We're the ones who've actually done the investigation. We have the evidence, and it's not, it's not an idle claim. It's not an allegation. It's not a theory. We have the evidence. We have the perfected allegations, which shift the burden back to those people to say, all the evidence shows that you're corrupt. Now, you have the burden to prove that you're not corrupt because of the evidence. And, there will be an accounting. I can't give you all the details, but we are going to use the law against the corruption. And because the only other alternative then is if you want to start a shooting war to take back the government. That's a pretty messy process. And even then, what the American public needs is they need to have firm facts, real evidence. They need to understand how and why the government has become corrupt. And I feel like I'm fairly confident that if the American public actually knew what was going on, there would be very rapid change. Because we still do have at least the semblance of a political system that is based on a democratic participation. And if they lose that, they'll lose the ball game.
And what can people do who want to support your effort and the effort of other whistleblowers in the government and whistleblowers outside the government in private industry or for government agencies?
The thing that everybody needs to do, regardless, again, of what your political persuasion is, you need to start paying attention to facts. I stopped listening to the mainstream media about 2 years ago simply because it was obvious to me that they were not about giving people facts and knowledge. We are going to give people facts, and we will publish them. They will see it. They will hear it. We're going to try to educate people in a sense of giving them the history, as my letter to Senator Feinstein does. It begins to open the door to say, this is what happened. And you as a senator need to be concerned, not just because, of all the patriotic stuff about, American flag waving, but because what's happened is this group has taken over your role as a legislature. If you pass laws, they don't care. They will decide what the law is and whether it's enforced. So why do we even have a Congress?
Well, that is a good question. That is a good question. If these Congress people are not forcing the government agencies, which they're supposed to be in charge of, to enforce the laws and regulations, what's the point?
Exactly. And that's what we're doing right now, is we're challenging them with the facts. With the facts and the evidence, and we've got a lot of it. I mean, it's piles and piles of it, and I was just working the last couple of days putting together some of the documents that I have, and it's appalling when you read them and you realize that they're just simply, basically sticking their thumb in your eye and saying, we don't care about the law. We don't care about your rights. We don't care about the interests of the American people. We only care about ourselves.
Hey, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us on WorkWeek. I've been talking with Darrell Whitman. He was a former federal OSHA investigator, lawyer with the Whistleblower Protection Program here in San Francisco, and he discovered that not only were whistleblowers being retaliated against and their effort to be protected was thwarted by his own agency, by the Department of Labor, and by really a group of inspector generals throughout the United States at the U.S. government agencies. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.